Hello. For my presentation and research paper project, I really wanted to look more into memories of murder. And after doing a lot of research, um, I found that my understanding of the movie changed like dramatically. Um, and I think that there is both a surface level understanding, um, and something that I think goes even further than I first even thought about. And after reading a few different academic papers about it, I definitely changed a lot of my viewpoints about the film. So the title of this is How Will We Remember? How Memories of Murder Both Deconstructs a Nation's Trauma and Challenges Our Notions of Historical Knowledge. So first, I want to start with a lot of the basic stuff. Some of this stuff we actually talked about in class and had in the presentation. Um, but I think it's important to kind of add a little bit onto that and talk about some of the stuff that we've also talked about just to kind of get a refresher. Um, so the historical context, introduction, and understanding memories of murder and how Bong deconstructs a nation's trauma and its twisted criminal justice system. It's important to know the historical context. This film is obviously about the murders, but it's also about much more than the retelling of an old crime. And it's very evident in this film that the entire film is filled with Bong's idea regarding the nation's history and the nation's trauma as a whole. So just a brief kind of summary of what was going on. I know we talked about a little bit of this in class, but after Park Chung-hee, the father of the recently impeached South Korean president, was assassinated in 1979, General Chun Doo-hwan became the dictator. And after that, there became a lot of attention placed on suppressing essentially pro-democracy movements. And there were a lot of people put to death. Initially, the government at the time released that there was a few hundred, but today they think that it could have been a couple thousand, if not more. And one of the most famous kind of events was the Gwangju uprising. Um, and just in general, there was a lot of police brutality across South Korea. Just one little drop in the bucket was when a 21-year-old university student was tortured to death due to his alleged anti-government activities and pro-democracy activities. And this was part of what historians now call the June Democratic Struggle. And Memories of Murder takes place in 1986, which is important for several reasons. One, this is actually kind of towards the latter end of General Chun Doo-hwan's kind of reign as dictator. And there's also a lot going on in South Korea in terms of it's reaching a level of what people call modernity, modernization, a shift kind of would happen in the next decade, especially. And the reason that's really important is because of the emphasis on time and history, which I'm going to talk a lot about later. So the historical context for Memories of Murder, it's the story of the film is honestly a lot more about the military dictatorship, which is carefully woven behind this outer layer of a crime thriller. And we've talked a lot about this genre bending that Bong does that, you know, will kind of come up again. So, you know, during this time, human rights were undermined daily. Society's mistrust of the government increased. The police force were just like the military, torturing, violence, a lot of abuse. And I think what's really important and what's going to be important kind of later in the presentation is Bong doesn't just necessarily retell history of the 1980s, mostly because a lot of it is really uncertain in some regard and what facts are actually facts. Instead, he more subtly crafts a memory of the history rather than the history itself. A good quote that I found in one of the academic papers I was reading was from Pierce Conrad, which is memories is, of course, conceived around the notion of memory. However, it's not the memories of the film's characters are important, as we learn nothing of the histories of the film's central protagonists, which is true. We don't know much about any of, especially the two main cops. Any backstory we receive on minor characters is only present to serve as a signifier to a historical moment or to symbolize a collective national trauma. The film is representational of a national memory of historical traumas. So I want to briefly just guide through, just the surface level stuff, the national trauma, the connections between, what was going on kind of in the more even rural areas with the police and what was going on a larger scale. And then I want to really shift into the deeper kind of less talked about, more theoretical side of Memories of Murder. So obviously we've talked about the civil defense drills that are constantly appearing, the suppression of demonstrations. There's one scene in particular where there's a large crowd and obviously you can see the military and the people kind of going head to head. The police brutality, the lack of emotion by people around the crime scene, and emotion from people in the movie in general, I think is important. And obviously just the general tone and feeling of this film is very grim, very also hazy, which plays into that, I think, memory aspect of the film. So the police force, Park and Cho are, I guess, quote unquote, bad cops, but it speaks to Bong's direction and Song's ability as an actor, not only to play it all for laughs, but to make Park a likable character. Bond makes it explicit that these detectives are not a few bad apples, but kind of representational of the whole system. The reason I included this is because I think the characters were definitely drawn to them in some way. And I think that with that, it becomes somewhat easy to think of this as a traditional, cop detective film. And it's very apparent to us that that doesn't stick. But I think just this very, very simple idea of them being likable characters, but definitely bad at their jobs in some regard. I think it's important because it obviously makes that connection of what's going on a larger scale in South Korea. But there's this also idea of what happens when ordinary people face unordinary phenomena. More frequently than not, Bong argues, ordinary people are guilty of perpetuating cycles of exceptional violence. This violence is not uniquely limited towards the serial killings. In the wake of the chase, police officers terrorize citizens with their own kind of brutality. And we actually talked about this a little bit in class, especially kind of towards the ending gaze, the ending shot of the film, talking about that perpetuation and what people are responsible for. But this idea of how ordinary people face ordinary phenomena and kind of the idea of how people act, how history has recorded that, I think is a very, very vital part of the film, which I'll go into kind of more. So just quickly, some of the examples of the police failures, obviously the lack of protections for crime scenes. Children are playing around the crime scene with a corpse lying there. Police chief's the only thinking about the media portrayal of the story. Forging of evidence, the fake footprint recordings, forcing confessions out of tortured innocent suspects, physical and emotional abuse against suspects. The quote, even kids in this town know you torture innocent people. Anyway, I won't be one of them, never. And then finally, the cruel interrogation mechanisms and a general apathy towards people, both innocent and suspected. All right, so here's where we really now dive into, I think, something that is less visible about Memories of Murder. So how do we take this a step further? There's four main questions that I want to talk about, four main ideas that I want to talk about that are very apparent in some of the academic papers I've read and just my kind of thinking about the film in general now. So how do we take this a step further? We've talked about genre bending, but let's think about its purpose more. What is the purpose of things such as the notable shots of generic paperwork and dates? How does time work in the film? And then what are the film's ultimate ideas and what is its purpose? For broad questions, four very, uneasily answered questions, but four questions that I think can be looked at through a different lens after learning a little bit more about the film and some theory. The Archive and How We Remember History, an academic paper on memories of murder that I've really focused on was Memories of Memories um, by Joseph Jong-hyun Jaeon. And the reason I focused on this paper is, first of all, it was pretty long and dense, but it really took a completely different approach on talking about memories of murder. And actually, fun fact, I'm pretty sure that the guy who wrote this, when I was learning more about him, he's worked at a number of universities. I think he was a visiting professor at Pomona College at one point. So that's kind of cool. I don't know if that's, I think that's what it said. I don't know. It doesn't really matter too much. But let's get into some of the ideas from his paper and some of the things we can derive from that. So we talk about genre bending, but let's think about its purpose. There is such a seamless transition between the narrative modes, from detection to nostalgia, that one scarcely notices that the initial rules of the game have shifted. Now, this is a quote from the paper that I really like because I think it's completely accurate. Initially, especially very beginning of the film, excuse me, we are very much aware that this seems and feels like, a buddy cop, serial killer movie, it feels like it. The tone of the movie feels like it. The characters, the way they interact feels like it. But that quickly becomes completely turned on its head. I think that the biggest idea of that is that there becomes this episodic nature of the investigations and the crime scenes, which, yes, would relate on one hand to the fact that it is a serial killer, but I think more so the fact that we kind of go around and around and we're never given that resolution, that final answer, which, of course, because at the time there was not a final answer on who did it and everything like that. But I think there's more to it. I think there's actually a lot more to the way things flow in the film, and the fact that there is no kind of final resolution in terms of looking at the bigger picture. The lack of closure in the investigation becomes an occasion for the film to explore deeper failures of historical memory. What does that mean? Well, we're going to come back a lot to this idea of historical memory, to history, to facts of history. I think the easiest way to put this is to completely question our idea of history as a whole. What do we know as fact? What do we know as completely true? And I'm not saying to completely throw out documents or real things that have happened, but instead to actually question a little bit about how much we really know and how history is completely recorded. The detective plot gradually loses its momentum and eventually dissipates, as if to reveal that we were actually never moving towards an end, but rather wandering around aimlessly, as in one of the large fields that the film's cinematography frequently captures in its steady, wide-angled gazes. All right, so what does this all mean? Well, let's go kind of to the next portion, the generic paperwork. Coincidences of date in this film, as we shall see, are far from, well, I didn't finish the sentence, but far from coincidental. I think that there are many, many instances of dates that are being pointed out that are not necessarily references to real-time history, although they are that as well, but even something as more ordinary. There's a lot of shots of paperwork, newspaper. Most notably, I'll actually show it on the next slide, is the close-up of the hospital document that occurs kind of towards the end of the film. And there's dates that can be seen on them. And of course, the easy answer is, okay, well, why does that matter? This is supposed to be a historical, realistic film. Obviously, there are going to be dates, but there's something more to it. With the documents, especially when there's these long close-ups of documents, it doesn't feel like we're watching a film anymore. Instead, it feels like we're reading this document, like we're searching for the facts in it, like we are one of the characters in the film. Obviously, it's not as easy when you don't read Korean, but even then, just the dates are very important. Um, it's a prominent trope in the film, quick close-ups of documents, newspaper that not only situate the viewer in chronological trajectory of the investigation, but situate the viewer in terms of talking about history. So how does time work in this film? Combined with the rehashing of dates throughout as an element of police work, we get a sense of time simply passing, ordinarily passing. There was a lot in the academic paper that compared these two different types of passings of time. A lot of it kind of went over my head, but I'm starting to finally get a little bit of a sense of it. Um, what he argues is that in this film, there is a sense of time that is very aptly ordinary, banal, very empty time, rather than time that is necessarily funneled by events and funneled by situations. Why does that matter? Because eventually, he argues that the empty time is what is kind of important in the developing of a nation, and more so, the empty time is actually what is less talked about in terms of history. So the relationship between calendar time, the construction of modern Korean nationhood, is certainly a concern in the film. A quote from the paper: marking an important, though otherwise acknowledged, anniversary. I guess I should preface this with the fact that in the hospital document, there is a date that is roughly 1 year after the very first date we see in the film, which is 1 year after the first kind of killing, the serial killing starts. This fact reminds us that a year has passed since the murder, but at the same time, it calls attention to the paucity of facts in the investigation. Indeed, it seems that the only certainty that we can claim an hour and 45 minutes into a film that is just over 2 hours long is the fact of time. There's not much we can really say about anything. We can't really talk about who's done what, how these murders have happened. And the only thing that seems to be fact is that time has been passing. Again, seems like a very subtle, unimportant notion. Well, yeah, of course, time is passing in movies. That's exactly what happens. But there's more at work here. What is the film's ultimate purpose or ideas? The lack in closure, as we've talked about in the film, becomes an occasion for the film to explore deeper failures of historical memory. But Memories of Murder does more than just simply register the frustration of the investigation. And instead, it transforms this story of failed detection into a parable of epistemological uncertainty, expanding its scope such that it becomes a historical parable. What does that mean? Well, there are a lot of connections between the investigation to time to even history in this film. And the argument that I would make and that Joseph would make is that there are a lot of ways in which the film matches or symbolizes time passing, not only in terms of the investigation, but in terms of Korea and its modernization, but also just history as a whole. Obviously, the emergence of a serial killer in the rural areas of Korea functions to signal an encroaching modernity and awakens this rustic setting to the horrors of modern life. We've talked a little bit about that in class. The ending of the film very much shows that modernity, very much shows that what has changed in, 20-ish years, and how not only the main character has changed, but Korea as a whole has changed. So it's all about history and nostalgia. Nostalgia is a very important idea. The banality of the fact of in the film seems to register historical memory, but not so much about whether old traditions will be preserved. More so, it's about an idea of history. Memories of Murder registers this anxiety about how the present and recent past will be remembered and how current events will be processed into historical knowledge. So it's all about history. It's all about history. The fact that we can't put down or name a lot of the facts in the film, the passing of time, this whole idea of what was going on in South Korea at the time it's much more than remembering what was happening. Instead, there's this anxiety about how much of it do we remember? How much of the important things that happened are actually written down, talked about even today? And how will current events be processed into historical knowledge? There's this idea of, quote, the end of history, where history is no longer written down and things are no longer changing because we as a society have gotten to a point where things aren't changing too much. Nothing notable is happening. It's a very theoretical idea, but this idea of how current history and maybe even future history, now this very modern, postmodern era, will be remembered is a very important idea. In this entire calculus, Joseph says, the underlying problem is like a kind of amnesia, forcing us to foggily ask where are we and how did we get here? Ultimately, the real missing person in this film is neither the absent murderer nor an unfound victim, but rather the body politic of the national imagery. There's a lot here. There's a lot here. And I still think that I'm trying to unwrap it, but there's something very interesting here because it takes what could be a very detective film about just a real life serial killer, and it makes it into something more. It makes it into something on a larger scale. How do we remember history? How will we remember history? There's a feeling in this film that is about anxiety, about time passing, about what is and what is not facts, what is recorded. There's a lot of references to newspapers, to documents, you know, even one of the main characters, the idea of documents being fact, documents being what is true, is questioned by the film's end. You don't really know what is and is not true. And on the larger scale, it's about history. And not only the history of the past, but the history of now. How will history be remembered? How will things be processed into historical knowledge? And this idea is really interesting to me because something as fact as history, something that we just take as, okay, you know, this is what it was, you know, here is what was written about, now we know the answer, becomes a lot more abstract, becomes more vague. Do we really know everything? How is history being recorded and what does it really mean? These questions, I think, are very apparent in Memories of Murder. And I think the more and more you watch, as I did in this film, the more it becomes less about the detective story and instead much more about the overall history of South Korea, but even history as a whole.